Hello, my name is Mary Frances Cooper, President and Director of Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh. It is my honor and privilege to welcome you on behalf of the board and staff of our library to this very special conversation between Robin DiAngelo, author of the vital and necessary book, White Fragility, and Dr. Valerie Kinloch, Dean of Pitt School of Education. I would also like to welcome you on behalf of the supporters and sponsors of this program. The program is made possible with a grant from the Heinz Endowments. It is co-presented by Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh, City Theater, and Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures, and is presented with support from UPMC Center for Engagement and Inclusion, Carlow University, Carnegie Mellon University, Carnegie Museums of Natural History, and the University of Pittsburgh Office of Diversity and Inclusion and Winchester Thurston School's Parent, Guardian, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. I do wish that we could all be together in the library lecture hall or in the music hall of Carnegie Museums for this important program. Eliminating systemic racism and achieving racial equity will only succeed if we work collectively. Please know that a great many people signed up for this program, and that books on racial equity and social justice have been among the most borrowed from the library, even during this pandemic. At Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh, equity and inclusion is a key pillar of our strategic plan. We have been working with our community to truly understand what an equitable and inclusive public library should be. At the same time, we know that each of us has to examine our own biases and experiences constantly and consistently to be sure that we are not inadvertently perpetuating the behaviors that we are striving to eradicate. We are fortunate that Dr. DiAngelo will be in conversation with Dr. Valerie Kinloch, the Renee and Richard Goldman Dean of Pittsburgh School of Education. Dr. Kinloch's work has focused on urban education, diversity and inclusion, and community engagement. I know her from her leadership in the Pittsburgh-based, internationally recognized Remake Learning Initiative, a network supporting in-school and out-of-school learning to help students navigate rapid social and technological change. She is a strong advocate for engaging, relevant, and equitable learning practices within that network. Our featured speaker, Robin DiAngelo, will be introduced by Susan Beda, Engagement and Inclusion Director at UPMC. I met Susan when a library colleague and I sat with her and her colleague to learn from them the ways in which UPMC incorporates equity and inclusion in their staff and services, in the hopes that it would provide some insight for our library. I found her to be generous with her time, thoughtful and committed to her work, and was quite impressed with her strategies to engage the community in these efforts. Welcome, Susan.
Good evening. I'm Susan Bida, Director of Diversity and Inclusion for UPMC. It is a great honor and pleasure to introduce our featured author tonight, Dr. Robin DiAngelo. UPMC is a very proud and leading supporter of the Pittsburgh Arts and Lecture Series, bringing a diverse range of celebrated authors from around the world to the Pittsburgh stage. This is part of UPMC's commitment to diversity and inclusion as the largest employer in the state of Pennsylvania with over 90,000 employees and 40+ hospitals. An essential part of our diversity and inclusion strategy is to enhance the diversity and cultural competency of our employees. Our initiatives include diversity trainings, pipeline development programs to increase retention and promotion of diverse employees, facilitation of employee resource groups, and engagement in community service projects. Based on these efforts, I am so proud to share that for the second year in a row, UPMC has been ranked #1 in Diversity MBA's 2020 ranking of best places to work for women and diverse managers. Now it is with great pleasure to virtually introduce Dr. Robin DiAngelo. Her book, White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, has been on the New York Times best-selling list since 2018 and reached #1 ranking this past June, soon after the death of George Floyd, when mass protests emerged across the country. She is a national expert on issues of racial and social justice with over 20 years of experience working with a wide range of organizations, including private, nonprofit, and governmental. In 2004, she received her PhD in multicultural education from the University of Washington in Seattle. And her dissertation back then was called Whiteness in Racial Dialogue. She holds 2 additional honorary doctorates and is currently an affiliate associate professor of education at the University of Washington in Seattle. She coined the term white fragility in 2011. As a child, Dr. DiAngelo grew up in poverty after her parents divorced when she was 2 and her mother died of cancer when she was 10. And she has written that her experience of poverty would have been different had she not been white, reflecting that although she feels she faced class oppression, she also benefited from racial privilege. The timing of her engagement with us tonight could not be more ideal as our nation faces a critical turning point in efforts to end racism. We are so thrilled to invite her to the virtual stage, Dr. Robin DiAngelo, to help shine light on this path. Thank you.
So, Robin, thank you for joining me and being in conversation with me about your New York Times bestselling book, White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. I want to just get started by having you tell me, how are you? Like, how are you doing?
Oh, well, first, thank you for the conversation. It's been challenging, I mean, there's the state of the union, if you will, on so many levels at this moment. In some ways, I should have absolutely expected a backlash around my book, given that it's about racism, which I think is probably the most charged issue in our society and the most fiercely protected issue in our society. But it has been intense and a little bit off kilter around how to adapt to it, respond.
That makes sense. So why do you think it's the most charged issue?
Because our country was founded on 2 really key intersecting dynamics, which was the kidnapping and enslavement of African people, which built the wealth of this country at the same time that the theft of indigenous lands and genocide. Those are the 2 anchors in the social racial construct, and everything really does proceed from that initial kind of anchoring of this country in our consciousness. And so it's infused in the society, it's infused in the foundation of the society. And many of the ways I would actually say almost all the ways we've responded to that reality has functioned to protect looking at it or changing it or challenging it. And so white taboos on talking about race function beautifully to protect the racist foundation of this country, and so on. I do think it's the hardest social issue to talk about, the most politically and emotionally charged issue, and the most enduring perennial issue of the last several hundred years.
And yet we are still here in this moment where we are talking about race, we're talking about racism, we're talking about systemic oppression, we're talking about violence against Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and other peoples of color, and we're still trying to move mountains. Yeah. Why are we still in this place of continuing to talk about, without, as you write in your book, offering and implementing some concrete solutions?
Yeah, and I see that as like many threads that come together. So I'm just going to be blunt. The status quo is racism. The status quo of every institution's outcomes is racism. By every measure, Black and brown people are at the bottom. I think we all know that. So in that way, our institutions quite effectively function on a daily basis to reproduce racial inequality. That's the status quo. And as a white person, I live, work, love, play, move through a society in which racism is the status quo, in which it is the norm, not an aberration. I move through that society in racial comfort. I mean, I really want every white person to just pause and hear me say that. I am comfortable in a racist society as a white person.
Ooh. And yet, your comfort in a racist society as a white person is my discomfort in a racist society as a Black person from the segregated South who has written about and continues to think deeply about equity and inequities in education. Your statement is powerful, that you live in a world where you are aware of these racist worldviews, and it's a level of comfort for white people. How do we begin to interrupt that?
Yeah, and let me just say a few more things about it, because we come to feel entitled to the comfort as white people, right? We come to feel that everything we have, we deserve and we've worked for. You know, it's easier to talk about what happens to you, and it's much harder, I think, for white people to talk about internalized superiority. The internalization that what I have, I deserve because I'm fundamentally more deserving, more hardworking, more of everything. We're talking about white superiority. That's really hard to look at. But if I come to feel both entitled to, well, I'm also invested in a status quo that not only is comfortable, but that serves me, that has served me as I struggled with other barriers that I do face, right? And so this demand for comfort, this demand and expectation that if I'm uncomfortable, there's been a breach in the social contract, functions to protect, again, the racist status quo. So as long as we understand racism as individual acts of conscious meanness that only mean people would ever do, we're not going to be able to challenge the status quo. I don't know that you could have come up with a more effective way to protect the status quo than reduce what it means to be racist to be a consciously, intentionally mean individual. That beautifully exempts really all white people. Pretty much all white people, and guarantees defensiveness, because now it makes being a good moral person, a nice person, and collusion with racism mutually exclusive. And so that's a pretty tight hold. You know, there are other threads, but those are key.
So let's jump to any of your trainings, any of the public conversations. How do you help, if at all possible, move white people to understanding that racism is not an individualized experience or act? It's more than the individual. How do you help your audiences grapple with that?
Yeah, well, so first I just want to acknowledge I have some things going for me that you may not. One, I'm white. So as an insider to whiteness, there is a way that I can name it and admit to it. It's almost like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Hey, you know, and we know, come on, we know, that you really can't deny. If you try to say that, then, you know, you are dismissed as biased and that you don't know my experience. I do have a lot of credibility at this point behind my name, which helps. And I have generally captive audiences and time. And the captive audience allows me not to open the space for argument and debate. And, you know, I don't proceed as if everybody's opinion is equal, because they are not equal. I have an opinion on the sky, but Neil deGrasse Tyson comes into the room, I'm going to step back. Okay. So they're not all equal. And so by kind of keeping a strong container around that, you know, wanting to take us down the rabbit hole of every, you know, rebuttal, that helps. And then scaffolding it, right? That apparently most white people don't understand socialization and actually think it's possible to be objective as a human being. So you have to start with that, and then we have to understand implicit bias.
Yes.
And then we have to understand what happens when a group's collective bias gets backed with legal authority and institutional control, right? So you have to kind of scaffold these concepts. And then lastly, overwhelm them with imagery and evidence that makes it undeniable.
What are some of those images?
Oh, I have, and I show nothing violent in the sense of violence towards Black people, but just the ideal nature of whiteness. Like, I spend a lot of time looking for single images because I'm a visual learner that I think powerfully capture a concept, right? So we could talk about a group's collective bias backed with legal authority and institutional control. Okay, I could probably track that, a little bit abstract. And then I show a picture of the House Freedom Caucus sitting around a conference table. It's 100% white, 100% male, 100% probably wealthy, and they're discussing the healthcare bill, sitting at the table, making decisions that affect the lives of those who aren't at the table, right? In an instant, that is the best visual I could ever offer for what it means to say a homogeneous group backed by power. For the concept of white supremacy, so let me back up here because that's a charged term. I think folks like us are quite comfortable with the term, but I grew up thinking it meant people in white hoods. It includes people in white hoods, but it's a highly descriptive sociological term for the society we live in. A society that elevates white people as the standard, the norm, and the ideal for what it means to be human. And then the single picture I have for that is the Sistine Chapel, God creating man. Right, just the relentlessness of it. And so it doesn't mean there aren't a few folks who will deny it, but it's hard to deny. And that kind of pointing the finger this way, which I can do as a white person, which helps white people go, okay, if she can admit that, and I've felt that too, I've seen that too. So those are some of my strategies. And of course, they're particularly available to me because of my position as a white person.
And so because they're available to you because you are a white person and you identify as a white woman, how do you understand the complexities that you write about in your book when you are having a session with an audience, a room full of people, and you are co-presenting, co-facilitating with a Black facilitator, and the disregard that oftentimes come toward that Black person in comparison to you? Like, what is that process of interrogating those types of engagements?
Yeah, I mean, I have found that it's really useful to preempt a lot of it by naming it, to actually start out naming, consciously or not. You're going to hear me different than you hear, say, Valerie. Yes. You're going to be responding differently. There's absolutely no response or thought you're going to have that isn't about race, right? That's outside of race. So keep holding. How does my race shape my response, right? So it does help to just name that. Whenever I'm co-presenting, we are strategic about who should go first, who should say what. And it's not always that the person of color should go first, right? It depends on what is the message and what is the time and all that. But those are the things we talk through. And then how will we check in with each other if something needs to be passed back because I or she would be the best person to speak to it. So it's kind of a live navigation. And it comes from recognizing that these dynamics are always present. There's nothing, I actually ask white people, remove the phrase regardless of race. Just remove it.
Please.
It's happening.
Get rid of that.
Yeah. Well, there's a few more I'd like to get rid of. Reverse discrimination or reverse racism. And
I was going to ask you about that. Yes, indeed. I was going to ask you about this reverse racism language that people are using and they've used forever, but people are more readily using. This is reverse racism. What does that mean? Let's get rid of that.
Well, my area of scholarship is critical discourse analysis. So I do think deeply about language and how language isn't a neutral descriptor for some fixed reality. The language we have shapes how we perceive that, what we might consider reality. So isn't it interesting? Reverse racism is going in the wrong direction. It's going backwards, right? We don't need to put a qualifier when it's just going the way it should go, if you will. And in my experience, most people who are complaining about reverse racism aren't people who have taken a lifelong stance against racism, right? So that begs the sociological question how that functions. But when you understand the systemic nature of racism, right, then you understand that reverse racism doesn't exist, because racism is collective bias backed with legal authority and institutional control. Everybody's biased. Absolutely. You are just as biased as I am. And you could be biased towards me because I'm white when you don't even know me. You could assume I'm clueless, which would actually be a safe assumption to make unless I show you differently, but nonetheless. And you could be mean to me because of your bias. That would be discrimination. But it doesn't have the impact that my bias towards you has, because my bias is backed with the depth and weight of history and institutional power. So the very best example I've ever come up with is women's suffrage. And we're going to just start with the way we're taught in textbooks, right? That, let's say, prior to suffrage, women could be prejudiced against men and angry with men and mean to a man in an individual encounter. But could women as a group literally deny every single man in the entire society his civil rights? No. Could men as a group deny every single woman in the entire society her civil rights? Yes. They're both prejudiced. What's the difference? Well, it's a very profound one. He has control of the institutions, and that transforms that. And we just have to have language that speaks to the profundity of that difference. And we trivialize it when we say it's all the same. And I need to add, it was white women who were granted access to the right to vote by white men. So here's another.
In my mind, because I was going to ask,
yeah, that's why I said I'm going to tell it like a textbook. But this is another aspect of institutional power, right? Is that the dominant group's experience is held up as universal. So while we were oppressed as women, we were absolutely privileged as white. There's no more a collective woman's experience than there is a collective human experience in societies deeply separate and unequal by race on the physical plane. Not talking about the spiritual plane, talking about where we live on the physical plane. Yeah.
I really appreciate this because you basically answered the next 5 questions that I have. And this is great. I was going to ask you a question about language, and you basically went there. And so I want to go there even more. You just said implicit biases. And I wonder, is it really fair to qualify bias with implicit as opposed to just bias? Because we have explicit biases that we don't oftentimes talk about. So how do we begin to undo how we name things? Implicit biases, those sort of biases that are kind of underneath the surface, not as visible, but they're there, in comparison to explicit biases that are it's the same thing with people saying micro and macro aggressions. These are aggressions. And how do we move toward a larger conversation about how we name things, how we don't name things, and how people take these things up into a deeper understanding of what are biases, what are aggressions toward other people? And I just wonder what you think of that.
I absolutely think language is critical. Language is political always. This is why language is always a site of struggle, and why I think it's worthy for us to notice and be willing to interrogate and problematize language. I do think there may be a distinction between what I'm aware that I have bias around and what I'm not aware, or that I'm in denial about. And this is a great challenge for white progressives, which I am, and I'm going to assume most people listening who are white progressives, is the degree to which it is important to our identities not to be biased. We can be in denial and very defensive about our biases so that we end up protecting them. I have responded to situations and said and done things that I really had no idea that I was doing until it got called to my attention. Then you're like, oh my goodness. So for me, that would be implicit bias. And then there's thoughts that flash across my mind that I'm kind of shocked that flashed across my mind. But any white person who says they've never had a consciously racist thought, I think is not telling the truth. And if I may, I think the Amy Cooper situation was just a perfect example of an implicit bias that almost instantaneously moved to an explicit bias.
Tell me how. How did that move from an implicit to an explicit? Where was the implicit, in your opinion?
Well, let's start, if I'm going to use that, let's start with how deeply encoded in geography race is.
Yes. So
that what's happening, I believe, of course, I'm imagining, is this part I'm not imagining, any space deemed valuable or that is desirable to white people is white space. So we're in Central Park, he's bird watching, so some nice part of Central Park, and that's white space. And she encounters a Black man. She might have had a conscious or unconscious little rush of tension in her body or fear. I mean, we've all been socialized into these stereotypes. I do have Black male friends, but I have a different response when I see a Black stranger suddenly in a public space, right? Having a Black male friend doesn't free me from the conditioning of a reflexive fear response.
And it doesn't free you or anyone else from still being racist.
Absolutely.
Because I think people use the excuse that I have a Black friend as a way to excuse themselves from being racist. It's a way to say, let me tell you something, but I have a Black friend, so I'm not racist, when in fact, having a Black friend does not exempt white people from being racist at all.
Well, in fact, I mean, it's just proximity, right? That's all it is. But since we went here, may I ask you, Valerie, what comes up for you? What thoughts do you have or reactions in your body when a white person says, I'm not racist, I had a Black roommate in college, or some version thereof?
I cringe. I'm just like, clearly certain conversations and experiences haven't happened that need to happen. We haven't been able to have productive engagements with race and racism in this society for someone to say, but I have a Black friend. And that Black friend doesn't exempt white people from not still being racist. It just means you might have a Black friend, but what types of conversations are you having with your Black friend? What are you seeing when you see your Black friend in comparison to other Black people? I just think, I cringe.
And I would want to add, was that Black friend at your wedding? All right, so bottom line is you're not convinced. Okay, I mean, I just want white people to hear that. The things we say that we think are evidence of a lack of racism, anyone with any understanding of systemic racism is rolling their eyes. Okay, so back to Amy Cooper, right? So white space, right? So she encounters Mr. Cooper, Chris Cooper, she, who knows what the initial reaction was, but then he actually tells her to follow the rules. And that now it moves it pretty instantly into explicit bias. How dare you? And I'll just invoke an old, Jim Crow South. When I come down the sidewalk, you will step down and you will not make eye contact with me. Right? We bring our histories with us in these encounters. So he tells her to follow the rules. How dare he? And now it's explicit because she knows exactly what she's doing. She tells him, I'm going to tell them an African-American man is threatening me, right? It's not like when she is asked for a description, she has to say that. Even before she calls, she's like, I'm going to get you in trouble. And my expectation is, even though I'm not following the rules, is that the entire institution will be behind me, not you.
Because she's a white woman.
Exactly. And on some level, she has to know that he might die as a result of that call. And that is anti-Blackness. That is the depth of anti-Blackness. And one last piece, which is white women's tears. The more dignified he is, the more unraveled and irrational she becomes.
Because she's assuming he can't be rational.
She's not in control, and he's not. She's not able to police his behavior through her white fragility, which is generally how we do police Black people's behavior. We're going to make it so punitive and miserable for you to challenge us that you're just not going to do it.
And one starts crying, one starts like bringing the attention to oneself as opposed to putting it on the topic or the situation where it needs to be placed.
Yes. And things tend to get worse when you do it. There's a question I've been asking for 20 years of Black members of the audience. I'll ask it of you if I may. How often have you attempted to give a white person feedback on their inevitable but often unconscious racist patterns and assumptions and had that go well for you?
Well, do you really want me to answer that?
I have a feeling it's the same answer go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think it's probably the same answer that you've written about in your book. I mean, how often have I not? How often have I not seen something, heard something has been directed toward me that's racist, and finding a way to name it and to say it to the person, and is it heard? It might be heard, but I think it's filtered through a particular way of hearing for some white folks, where the same example you just gave in reference to, as a white person, that white person might feel as if that person's power is no longer with them. How dare you, Black woman, tell me that you think what I just did is racist? And my question always becomes, how dare I not tell you? How can we not have a conversation about racism when it's directed toward a person and it's right in our face? How could we not have that conversation? And I just think that we do not know how to productively talk about race, let alone racism, particularly in this country.
Yeah, and if I may, I would say white people don't know how to productively talk about it, and because of that,
thank you for that, because I that's what I meant. White people don't know how to, and then the burden is placed on Black people and people of color
to turn themselves in knots trying to figure out, one, is it worth the likely response and the consequences? Two, how do I get this just right so that they can hear it? Like this just incredible psychic, emotional, intellectual weight. So you are certainly more likely to know how to have this conversation than we are, because so my point is that all of that defensiveness and lack of ability functions to ensure that we don't have the conversation, or that you're less likely to challenge me, because we've kind of pushed you into not doing that. We've made it so punitive for you to do that.
Yes.
And so it functions as
so punitive. I tend to internalize it, or other people of color might internalize it. And that has a negative impact on our health, our well-being, our safety, and the burden and the pain of racism and not being able to have white people hear and accept responsibility has a negative impact on how we live and function as Black people and people of color. And I just don't think that part is understood, that racism, racism is many things. It is especially a health issue that we internalize, and then we are expected to continue to be whole, healthy human beings within a racist society. And that's an issue. That's a problem. So how do you help people hear it? Like, in your book, you open, and when I first read your book, I sat there and I said, oh, is this really what she's saying? And in the beginning of your book, you write that this is a book for white people, that you are talking about white people and about what white people need to think differently about. But then you jump to talking about white progressives and liberals. And I just have to share what you wrote. I think I've got to find it. It's in the very beginning of the book. And I think you probably know exactly the part that I'm talking about, but you're right. This book is unapologetically rooted in identity politics. I am white, and I'm addressing a common white dynamic. I am writing mainly to a white audience. And when I use the terms us and we, I am referring to the white collective. And then you go on and you talk about, and speaking as a white person to a primarily white audience, I am yet again centering white people and the white voice in a way for you to talk with, to, and about white people. I don't have anything else for you, Robin.
In the sense of it makes sense to you, or would you like me to say a little bit about it?
I want you to think with me about,
yeah.
You started earlier in this conversation talking about there are things that you can say as a white person to an audience of white people. Mm-hmm. And that's how you open your book as well. This is a book for white people. Other people could read it, probably will read it, but you're talking to white folks. And I just want to know, do you think white folks are hearing you? Especially yes. White girls. Are they hearing? Are they grappling?
Well, they're certainly reading it and hearing the message, right? I mean, we know that this is a best-selling book, which is incredible. I would like to believe that at the very minimum, it has made it harder for us to run this kind of nonsense with no accountability, because we've run this kind of nonsense for hundreds of years with no accountability. And by putting language to it and by clearly naming it, not that people of color haven't been doing that, but we haven't heard that. And there's a particular way that phrase, white fragility, has resonated, that it's harder to do it. So I think it has changed and is helping to change the conversation. And of course, we won't get everyone. Even as you and I are having this conversation, because I know my people really well, there are white people who are thinking to themselves, oh, so-and-so really needs to hear this, right? No, if they were here right now, they'd be thinking of you really needing to hear this. You know, anywhere we can get ourselves out from under it, we do, which is one of the reasons why I give no quarter, if you will, all white people. And that drives white people crazy, right? You're generalizing, you don't know me. You know, individualism is a really precious ideology, but if I gave one, I sincerely believe nobody grows up in this country and doesn't know it's better to be white. Nobody grows up in this country and doesn't internalize racist ideology. It's in the water. But I also know if I gave any out, the majority of white people would take that out. I mean, if having a black roommate in college it certifies you as not racist, then trust me, you're going to take any out. So I'm trying not to let them get an out on that. But this is really Audre Lorde's beautiful master's tools dilemma. She has that beautiful quote, how do you dismantle the master's house when you only have the master's tools? And this is the sad thing, is that you have been saying this, I'm sure, for years. Many people of color have been saying these things. I think you understand the dynamics of white fragility to a degree that I never will. You've had to understand them and navigate them your entire life. I was in my 30s before I ever had to think about this, and only because I was pushed to think about this, right? And so to like yet again have a white person be the authority, like pretty much every person in front of us who's granted authority, and on race no less, yes, it reinforces subconsciously whiteness. And this is the tension and the dilemma, because one of the ways whiteness stays centered is by not being exposed or named or marked. So to decenter it, you have to expose it. And so this is a both end that I just live with, because to not use this credibility, this voice, this platform to break with white solidarity, for me would really be to be white. I'd like to be a little less white. And I want to take the opportunity to say, being less white doesn't mean more Italian American.
Right.
I'm not talking about that. It honestly, for me, means less ignorant about race and less arrogant in my ignorance, less certain, less silent, less inactive, less passive, and more humble and curious and open and active, right? That's to be less white. So it's a both end, but we're in the master's house.
Yeah, I want to go there with the master's tools, and
okay.
Because I don't know how you're reading my mind. I was thinking Audre Lorde on the one hand in terms of using the tools to dismantle, or can we really use those tools to dismantle? But there are all of these other scholars, a lot of scholars of color, who write about codes of power, who write about, people of color are more aware of these codes of power that we all operate by and under than white folks. And how is it that I can know more about white people and their privilege and their domination and sense of entitlement than they do about themselves? And that's a reality. Because I think if we go back to the earlier part of this conversation, you said as a white person, your worldview is racist. And yes, if your worldview is racist, then what is the responsibility that you have as a white person to know about racism, to know about all of the codes of power that function and operate in society and that are operating against Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and peoples of color and in favor of white people? I think that's a hard one for white folks, that there are these codes of power, there are these tools that they have access to that other people don't. And I think the excuse oftentimes is, I worked hard. It's that meritocracy, the ideology of individualism. I worked hard for what I have. Why can't they work hard as well? And that's troubling. That's problematic.
There's so much in there. So any white cisgender or any white person who identifies as a woman or female listening, and also a feminist, connect to how you likely understand more about patriarchy, androcentrism, male privilege than men do. Why? Because you swim against the current in that. And so the current's very visible. When you swim with the current, you don't see it. Anybody who's ever body surfed, and you just don't even feel it. And you're moving your arms, of course, but the outcome of that movement is different depending on whether you're swimming with or against the current. That was the last thing you said. I just so wanted to speak to. What was the last thing you said?
The codes of power, the tools, the most white folks aren't aware.
Yes. So what I would say is, in some ways, we have more responsibility to understand this and to know this. Of course, people of color are also socialized into racist ideology and play a role. That is not my business, and I don't speak to it. Right? It's not for me. My work is different. In some ways, we might think about it as my work is to address internalized superiority, and that's different than what you might look at. But I'm thinking about the hard work piece, and I'm thinking about Ibram Kendi basically saying, look, by every measure, we know that Black and brown people are at the bottom and white people are at the top. Most people aren't going to argue with that. We know that's true. And so there's really only two explanations. Black and brown people are inferior, and that's why they're consistently at the bottom, and white people are superior, or racism. And if you are not going to use racism as your lens to understand that outcome, then you're using a racist lens. So to say, I worked hard, why can't they, is to say that they are not working hard. It's to deny the structures, the current. It's a racist analysis, whether you intend it to be or are aware that it is. That's certainly the impact it has.
Oh, there's a lot there, Robin. There is a lot there. Kendi also writes about who gets to be racist and our perceptions of who, at least in the context of the United States, who aren't racist. And I think this is where you two might differ a bit, because he talks about everyone can be a racist. In your book, White Fragility, you are clearly saying that in the context of this country, white people are racist, and they have the power to be and the positions to be. So how can Black people be racist? And I find the analyses that you both offer to be very compelling. Can you talk about who are racist and who aren't? Can I be a racist?
Yeah, I'd love to. And I just had the pleasure of having a conversation with Ibram Kendi, and we got to flesh this out a little bit. So let's just start with, we both have the same agenda.
Yes.
We want less racism in the world, right? And so there's just somewhat different strategies about how to achieve that. And he was really clear that he's writing on how to be a anti-racist. He's writing to a Black audience, and I'm clearly writing to a white audience. He's kind of like, white people are spectators to that book, but because we're writing to a different audience, we have kind of different ways to achieve the ultimate goal. And so he was trying to push Black people that are complicit in the system to look at that. So a Clarence Thomas, a John McWhorter, Ben Carson. I mean, his point is they absolutely uphold a racist system, right? And in that way, they're behaving in racist ways. The way I would look at that is, and who does it serve? It doesn't serve the Black community. It always serves white supremacy. So that's where I make the distinction. And he would make a somewhat different distinction. But if we accept the premise that the status quo is racism, then you're either upholding it or you're interrupting it. Mm-hmm. And so he says that applies to everybody, right?
Right. And so when we think about systems of racism and we think about racist policies within institutions, within systems, how do we begin to really think deeply about, like, it reproduces itself. It gets reproduced in every context that we are in. And, and how do we begin to dismantle that in order to get to not, you write about not racist and anti-racist. And I think some folks would say, how do we become not racist? And the question becomes, how do we become anti-racist within these systems that continue to oppress and be unfair to other people? How do we do this work of anti-racism? And so the question for me right now is, how do we get folks to understand your goal should not be to become not racist? A goal should become to become anti-racist. And that's a big distinction.
Right. And anti-racism is an ongoing goal. So let me be clear. While the forces of race are shaping our lives even before we're born, in terms of infant mortality, in terms of the prediction that we could, of the outcome of our birth, we are, of course, taught to be racist, right? That ideology. But we've all been taught to collude with it, to participate in it, to internalize it, to different impacts on us, but the collective impact is structural racism and inequality, right? So to not actively be challenging that is by default to collude with it. This is why I think Ibram is saying anyone can be racist and anyone can be anti-racist, because
yes,
okay, anyone can collude or interrupt. But you don't arrive. So maybe a way that I think about allyship will help this. So a lot of white people call themselves allies, and I do not call myself an ally. I don't even call myself an anti-racist. I say I'm involved in anti-racist work, but it's really for you to decide if in any given moment I'm actually behaving in allied ways. And notice that
power. You're giving me that power to make that decision. Or not, you're not giving it to me. It's my power that I already have to make that decision about whether you are or are not.
Well, I'm the least qualified to make that determination. I'm the most invested in not seeing my racism. I'm like a fish in water. And so that kind of checks that certitude. It keeps me humble, but also accountable. It's like this, because I am a feminist and proud of it. Have you ever seen a man wearing a t-shirt that says feminist, or I'm a feminist, or, they're rare because, but I've seen them. And I have two thoughts. One, well, that's a pretty brave t-shirt to be wearing. And the other thought is, and yeah, I'll be the judge of that. Right. And very often I actually don't think that dude is a feminist, right? It's like that. It's like, he's not really the one to qualify himself as a feminist. I am the one to determine if he is a feminist in his life in any moment. And I feel it's the same way across race. That's for you to determine, not for me. whether you think I'm an ally. I can't anoint myself I'm an ally. And the piece about it's an ongoing life process. You don't just arrive and now you are not racist. If we did, then all the white people listening would already have arrived.
And we wouldn't be talking about this, and you wouldn't have to write a book about it and help other people understand it. And this idea of arrival is really problematic, because I think folks think that if I read 3 books this summer, then I am now an anti-racist. I've never read anything before. I've never had deep, sustaining conversations with anyone outside of my immediate community that looks like me. And now I am a white person who is an anti-racist, and I'm an ally, and an advocate, and a co-conspirator, all within the span of 2 months. and that presents a version of where I think a lot of folks are in their desire to become other than who they are, which is racist. And how do we, it's the question of not remaining complicit in a system that already is racist, that already has worldviews that are racist, and that every practice and policy, when we think about the entire country, what is it created on, and how have we not dismantled that? It just becomes a really interesting cycle of reproduction of racism and racist policies. And if it's for me to decide if you're an ally, I think that means that I have to be a critically conscious person of color who understands my role in not reproducing situations where people are violated or oppressed or discriminated against. And I have to always question myself, even as a Black woman. And I just think that we have to be honest about that burden and responsibility that's placed on people to have these conversations.
Yeah, and, so I don't think I'm going to be, well, first of all, I don't think racism is going to end in my lifetime. And I don't think I'll never be free of it. I can manage it. I can work to minimize it. I can work to minimize defensiveness when I run it. And I really do have very good repair skills at this point, right? But it's going on all the time. And this idea that, yes, you do understand it more deeply than I do, but this idea that you completely understand it is also problematic. So when we put it all, you just let me know if I'm doing anything racist, and now I just carry on and you'll let me know. Well, that's a huge burden to put on you.
Yes.
You have to take a huge risk in letting me know that I will respond well. And you don't know every moment of it because you've been conditioned into it too. So that's like saying, I am a feminist, but does that mean I recognize all the ways that I have internalized sexism in my marriage? Heck no. I got all kinds of hooks in my marriage that I don't see, right? So yes, all of us should be engaged in ongoing work. It's just somewhat different work. And I don't think it's for me to tell you what yours should be. But you actually can tell me what mine can be.
Oh, yeah. So when you were talking about Kinsey, you mentioned a few people. And one of the folks you mentioned is John McWhorter.
Yep.
Have you read his latest, or I think in July, have you read his essay that he wrote in reference to your book, White Fragility?
Definitely.
So at near the end, he says, White Fragility is, in the end, a book about how to make certain educated white readers feel better about themselves. He says that your outlook rests upon a depiction of Black people as endlessly delicate poster children within a self-gratifying fantasy about how white America needs to think, or better, stop thinking. Your answer, he says, to white fragility entails an elaborate and pitilessly dehumanizing condescension toward Black people. So,
want me to go, or do you want to have your?
You know what? You go for it.
Okay, we need to start, especially in general in this particular social landscape with the incredible divisiveness in our country, to always ask ourselves, so who's John McWhorter, right? Who's John McWhorter? Well, John McWhorter, I would say, is a neoconservative person who has written before on this topic and who is working on a book right now arguing that the anti-racist movement is more harmful than racism. So we can just start right there. I mean, who are you reading? Who in that very article says he has rarely ever experienced racism as a Black man and has in fact benefited from being Black, which is dog whistle to white conservatives about affirmative action. There are lots of dog whistles in his piece. And that what holds Black people back are attitudes, their attitudes, not white racism. So we have to start with, we are fundamentally if Ibram Kendi wanted to critique me or we wanted to engage, we're on the fundamentally same page around this, but he is not. In this moment of the incredible deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and now forgive me, his name is not coming to me, but someone who was just shot last night. In that moment, he doesn't mention any of that, just states that he's not experienced it. So clearly this is someone who doesn't speak for most Black people. And so you just have to look at it that way. I'm going to be honest, I'm kind of both surprised it got published because it's so inflammatory, it's so personal, innocent white readers being manipulated by me, and I want people to feel guilt, and it's just kind of ridiculous. And I'm also really disappointed at how many white people read it and automatically a Black man said this, and so I can't read Robin's book anymore.
Or I didn't even read it in the beginning. Or I'm not gonna read it. I'm not even gonna read anything else about it, which is an unfortunate reality for so many people.
Yeah, and it is. And whose agenda does that serve, right? Of course, not only will there be backlash against any breaking with white solidarity, any challenge to systemic racism, but there will be Black people given a platform to do that. And in some ways, it's a little more cowardly on the part of white conservatives to put a Black person up there to say that, because he's not going to be critiqued in the way that they might be. But I would just ask you, and certainly the thousands of Black readers who have written to me that the book has been incredibly valuable to them, what are your thoughts on John McWhorter's article?
Since this is not about me, Robin.
Well, but people have an opportunity.
Yeah, you know what I will say, I try my best to hear and listen to what everyone says, but at the beginning and end of the day, what is the ultimate goal here? For me, the ultimate goal is equity and justice. The ultimate goal is to work at dismantling systems that are racist and oppressive. And it is to have honest conversations about something that I think is a reality that many people might not agree with. We live in a racist society. We live in a fundamentally racist society where people of color have always been positioned as less than every white person, even poor and working class white people. We are always positioned as less than, as not intelligent enough, as we're not hard workers. And it is that myth that continues to, I think, drive racism and oppression. And yet it becomes so ingrained in our policies and within our institutions because hence they were built on racism. And we have not yet, as an entire society, been willing to try our best to dismantle. I think that we do as people, as groups of folks who are committed to anti-racism, equity, and justice. But, I read his piece and I was reading with interest because I wanted to know, I wanted to hear. But then, I got to the part in his review of your book where he talks about how your depiction of white psychology shapeshifts according to what your dogma requires. He talks about chapter 1, where you are saying that white people do not see themselves through a racial lens. They don't see themselves as racial people. But then you go on to chapter 4, where you're writing about white solidarity, and it becomes the defense of whiteness by white people. And so I think it's this interesting move. On the one hand, do white people see themselves as a racial group? I mean, I would hope so. And on the other hand, if they don't, then how can they defend their whiteness, their privileges, everything that benefits them when it's threatened by so-called anti-racist folks? And to answer your question, the shorter way of answering your question is, the commitment, in my opinion, has to be to dismantling anti-racist systems and structures. It's not going to happen in my lifetime, I don't think, but it's the work that has to always happen. And he has a certain position.
Yeah. Well, let me speak to that tension between we don't know and we do know. So we are aware that race exists, but absolutely we're raised to see that as what you have, not us, right? You have a race, I don't have a race. But I also have deeply internalized anti-Blackness, right? I have a deeply internalized sense of entitlement to move through the world only being seen as an individual who worked hard. So in the moments when that is challenged, that's when all of that rises up, right? And white solidarity is the unspoken agreement that we will protect in a way that lack of consciousness that serves us, right? And so I think, and this is part of what makes white people so often so irrational, is both those things are true. On the one hand, we really are oblivious. We really are. Now, it's a learned obliviousness. And then on the other hand, we know. Yes, we know. Come on. Do you think Donald Trump thinks that we don't know when he, invokes these tropes, or when dog whistle, racism is going on? So both these things are actually true inside of us. We really don't know, and we really do know, but we cannot admit that we know. And yeah, this is an irrational form of disconsciousness. So I experience it. Therefore, I'm fine with that. I don't see that as me shifting my dogma, but let's just say it was hard to open the Atlantic and see the title "Call My Work Condescending." So of course you might get a little bit of passion from me on that.
Oh yeah, and I mean, understandably so. So I do want to. There are lots of critiques of the work. There's, I think I read a piece that was published in the New York Times Magazine about white fragility everywhere. And it was written by Daniel Bergner. And he talks about just having the conversations, and do these conversations actually serve the purpose of moving toward equality? I think I know what you would say. I think you would say, in the absence of these conversations, when else will white people actually think deeply, reflect, come to terms with that obliviousness and that knowing simultaneously? And so I've been reading these critiques, but then what I want to do is just like to go back to the book. Like, we've got these critiques, we've got folks saying, you're talking down to Black people. We have other folks saying, why are you generalizing and talking to all white people in these ways? Because I'm different. I'm the one who's different. I don't need this. We have white liberals and white progressives who, some of them think that they're so woke that I get it. I hear you, Robin. My friend needs to hear this, but I don't as a white person. And so we have these multiple perspectives, and then we go back to the book itself. And so if we go back to the book, you are talking all about fragility. And I just want to make sure people understand your uptake of fragility as not just, in this moment, let me start crying. That's part of it. So we're going to put the critiques aside for a second. Fragility. what is it that folks need to get based on your uptake of white fragility?
Well, we really have to gain stamina to endure the discomfort of these conversations for us, the discomfort of a really honest examination of how we have absorbed racist ideology, anti-Blackness, all of that. The fragility part is meant to capture the fact that we don't generally have that stamina, and therefore we fall apart really quickly. We respond very poorly. We get defensive like that on a dime, right? And that again functions to silence and close off the conversation. And so in that way, it's not actually fragile at all. It's almost like broken glass, right?
That's
It's
right.
incredibly powerful, because it marshals behind it the weight of history, institutional power, social control, and can be quite punishing. Kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, making it so difficult for you to talk to us about this, that you have to agonize about whether you should and how should you. And it's exhausting. Now, asking white people to be more conscious, more aware, more educated, less defensive, more open. If some folks see that as condescending to Black people, I'm sorry. I don't see it that way. I'd like there to be less racial pain caused by us, not more by any means. Those were my thoughts there. So
No, that's great. That's great. I mean, I think that the reality of having less racial pain that is experienced and endured by Black people, people of color, should be an ultimate goal of all white people, because racism is a heavy burden, and it impacts all of us. And so I appreciate you talking about the goal of having less racial pain and moving white people to really grapple with that, interrogate that. But it's more than grappling with, right? It's this deep examination of whiteness, white privilege, white supremacy, inequities. And I think earlier in our conversation, you did use the phrase white supremacy. And I want to make sure that people who are listening to us, they understand what you mean. So can we go back to that? Because I think sometimes when folks hear white supremacy, oh my goodness, I'm not covered in a sheet.
right.
That's not me. So I am exempt. Can we just go back to that one more time so we can make sure folks hear what you really mean by white supremacy?
Yeah, it's white centrality. It's white people are held up as representing everything in one, from God to Jesus to Mary to Santa to authority to, that stories that are about white people told from a white perspective are seen as simply human stories speaking to the human condition. And stories that are told from a Black perspective are always Black stories, limited perspective, biased perspective, right? I often use the example of contrasting two filmmakers, Mike Leigh, who's a British filmmaker who makes beautiful films about the human condition, and Spike Lee, who's always a Black filmmaker who makes films about Black issues. And what it does by always marking Spike Lee's race, but never Mike Lee's, is it grants Mike Leigh objectivity, individuality, and universality, which is the ability to just be seen as speaking for everyone. And there's a film critic, Richard Dyer, who talks about that as the God trick. Like this disembodied voice just proclaiming truth from no position. And white people and white men in particular get to speak from no position. But when you are marked as marginalized, you always speak from that position. So that standard for what it means to be normal, neutral, human. Resmaa Menakem is a therapist and an activist who writes about racial trauma and racial healing. He has a powerful book called My Grandmother's Hands. I highly recommend it. But he says the white body is the standard by which all bodies shall be measured. And every hue, H-U-E, every hue away from that standard is a hue away from humanity or human. So we're back to the darker you are, the further away from human. I mean, that's hard to say and look at, but that is white supremacy. That's the culture we live in. It's on us to see that, to try to identify it, not to deny that it exists.
Yes, yes, yes. And that gets toward having less racial pain that's enacted toward Black people, Latinx people, Indigenous people, peoples of color. And also, yeah, we could talk forever. You started by talking about admitting to these racial constructs in this country. The country was founded upon. And these different racial constructs that I think some folks would say we don't need to remember and we don't really need to teach because that happened so long ago and it's not applicable today. And then we go from there to how we just talked about Kendi and thinking about racism, anti-racism, and racist politics and institutions. And then I didn't take you up when you called, our president in terms of, and we have this president and do folks really believe what he's saying when he talks about we don't live in a racist world, this country in particular? And I would say, you also mentioned, I think you were referencing Jacob Blake in Wisconsin. And there's Breonna Taylor in Kentucky. It's the pain and the trauma of racism that has a powerful impact on folks, and particularly me, folks who look like me, because I would be at the very bottom, at the very end of that line because of my dark skin. And the country has been founded on these racial constructs, these racisms. And we're in 2020. And we witness the killings of Black folks in the streets. We witness brutality and racism and oppression. And how is it that some folks can be so desensitized to this racism? Because it doesn't impact them directly? Because that gets back to that individualism? That's what I'm troubled with. How can we not be moved into action when we see and experience injustices and racism, even if it's not directed toward me, the person? I have to be moved. And how is it that some folks aren't? White people in particular, I'm talking about.
Well, I mean, on one hand, that's how deep it goes, that we would not be moved. But it does look like in this moment with videos, right? So I do not think there's an increase in executions and the terrible things that we're seeing. Absolutely not. The difference is it can now be proved. Because up until now, we just said that's not happening, or it couldn't be happening, or you must have done something. It doesn't happen to me. I haven't seen it, right? But you can't deny it anymore, right? When it's right in front of you, right? But it's also, and let me just say, in a lot of ways, it allowed me to have more equity in my home, neighborhoods I could call safe, that it served us. It's kind of like, I don't know what they're doing over there to keep you over there, but it's working for me. I'm just going to be really bald here, right? But now I can see it and I can't really live with that, okay? But I'm sorry, and I hope that I offend enough listeners to prove me wrong here, but I'm moved by the extreme cases. But now you ask me to get rid of tracking in school, which would not give my child the opportunity to have the best education. That I'm not going to do, right? So if it's inconvenient, if I have to give something up, that may not be as strong a commitment as an outrage.
That's the only way this is going to work for us. Like we've got to give something up in order to...
Or share, right? To really ask, why do I think my child should have the best of everything if it means that someone's child can't have the best, can't even have adequate in order for me to have that? So it's not just the extremes, right? And so I recently did a talk for a company. It was just a short talk, but before and after, they had these videos of Black employees talking about their experience. And the theme over and over was, every day I go home exhausted, right? And you mentioned this yourself. And I want to look in the eyes of every white person listening and say, just assume it's you that sends your Black coworker home exhausted to a degree that's different than the kind of exhaustion you feel. Just assume it's you, and then try to identify how might it be you. And I would submit that the inability to think critically about race, the inability to even talk about what it means to be white, how our lives have been shaped by our race, how I grew up poor, but I was also white, right? Our inability to do that actually creates a hostile environment for people of color living and working in primarily white space. Because if I can't grapple with my own whiteness, I'm going to have no critical consciousness about race. I'm going to have no skills to navigate a conversation as uncomfortable as this one. And I'm going to have no emotional capacity to withstand the conversation. And that means you can't be your authentic self. You know, again, I don't mean to speak for you. Check me if I'm wrong. I assume that in a primarily white institution, you know that most of the people sitting at the table, controlling the table, are white and cannot think critically about race.
Cannot or choose not to.
Okay, thank you, because it's not benign. I think there's a kind of willful refusal, but it's not going to be the N word, right? It's going to be that collective inability to hold this conversation that's going to create a climate that is not supportive of your experience. And then we're going to wonder, why can't we retain even when we recruit? Because we recruited people into hostile water, because we didn't address the water we were adding people into. We didn't address our own lack of consciousness, our lack of skills. We didn't see it as a requirement to lead people that you have some skill to and some nuance to engage in a conversation like this.
And we also don't provide people with the resources and mentorship that they so rightfully deserve and other people get. And we also don't question whether we have, how many faculty of color do we have? How many staff members of color? How many students? And it is the reproduction of whiteness that goes unnamed and unquestioned within these institutions. And then we get into a conversation where we might have, more than likely we do, every person who is in a position to make change happen, never really having grappled with or interrogated race and racism, not even thinking, wow, everyone here looks like me, white person, white people, white groups, white organizations, and not wanting to even look at, if we're going to go there, not even wanting to look at their own data. And so then we hire someone, and I will say, as Dean of the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh, I am the first Black woman to be dean of any school on this entire campus, not just education. And when I learned that, why do we think the reproduction of whiteness, white privilege, domination, why do we think those things continue to manifest themselves? We make the excuses that, on the one hand, we don't see race, we're colorblind. We are not colorblind. On the other hand, we make the excuse that, well, I just can't find anyone who's a person of color. I'm like, oh, we are just engaging in the reproduction of racism and racist politics and structures over and over again. And to what end? To what end?
Well, we see to what end. And so I'm hoping in this particular cultural moment, right, with the uprisings and folks like us are heartened that you're hearing in the mainstream, like the concept of systemic racism. I mean, we've worked for a long time to get, that into the consciousness of the mainstream. It doesn't mean that the person who's using it could follow up with an explanation of that, but it's still a start, right?
That's right.
but we're going to have to sustain this, and we're going to have to ask ourselves, so what do I need to put in place to sustain this when it starts getting hard again? That will be the measure of whether this moment is a true turning point. Yeah.
That's exactly right. Well, we have about 15 minutes, and there are two big things that I want to do with you,
Okay.
if you're okay. If we can dream with each other.
Oh.
So the first thing is about public education. The question becomes, I read White Fragility, I've read all of your works, I've had conversations with folks, now I'm talking with you. And when we think about anti-racism or equity, what is it that we can dream about and seek to implement in public education? How do we do public education differently in this country, especially for students of color? And it's not that I want a manual. I don't want to dream with you about a manual. I want to dream with you about all of the work that you've done, anti-racist trainings, diversity trainings. You've been a professor. You've been doing this work for a very long time. You're talking to white folks. You're pushing them to see that they are racist as a collective. Now we take all of that and we turn the gaze on public education, especially in this country. We turn the gaze on public education in communities of color that are not as wealthy as white communities and white school districts. How do we imagine an anti-racist public education system for kids who look like me? Like, how do we imagine that? What would it need to include?
Well, it's hard in some ways. Do you want to add something?
Nope.
Oh, you came forward. In some ways, it's hard to imagine, right? I mean, we don't have a model for what it would look like. But let me start by saying, I think one of the primary bellies of the beast is education, is the institution of education, that our schools effectively and efficiently function to sort children into unequal places in society. And I think we all know it, or we would not care what school our children went to. But do we care what schools are? Oh, goodness, do we care? Why? Because they are absolutely unequal sorting mechanisms. And on that note, we do need a revolution in the same way that we need a revolution in what we think about in terms of criminal justice, what we define as criminal justice in this moment, right? Like, what is the role of the police? What should we be funding? What should we not? What could other people be doing? Right? So there's this whole conversation, and there are many who say you can't reform it, you have to revolutionize it. And I actually think it's similar with schools, that you couldn't have come up with a more effective way to set up inequality than the way we fund schools, right? Tax base and so forth. Mm-hmm. Testing, absolutely. Tracking, absolutely. We have data that's like tracking is not effective, but there's a deep investment in tracking. Why? Because tracking serves a particular group of children and not others. So I just feel like the whole thing has to start so far outside the box that it's a new system. But it would be a system in which Black parents didn't have to have their hearts broken by delivering their children every day into an institution with a clear record of harm towards those children. They didn't have to deliver their children into an institution that they fear on some level will break the spirit of those children. I mean, and I don't think I'm speaking out of turn here. That, I often tell white teachers, don't get your back up because Black parents don't trust you. It is absolutely rational that they don't trust you. Who doesn't know that there's a history of harm between our institution of schooling and Black children? Who doesn't know that? And they're delivering their precious children into that institution. you have to connect with them. You have to relate to that. You have to understand that. And then you have to, rather than feeling, well, you don't know me, why are you talking to me that way? You have to absolutely, like, I hear you. I commit to you.
I listen to
until we
you.
get the revolution.
Yeah, and I listen to you, and
Yes.
Black families, Black parents, Black communities. I not only listen to you, but I acknowledge your experiences. I acknowledge how, as a white person, there is complicity in a system that has disregarded and degraded you. And to be able to say it, admit it, and then to work to do the work that we need to do, to move forward in doing the work that we need to do. I don't know if you know the work of Bettina Love. Bettina Love is a professor at the University of Georgia, and she writes in her latest book titled, We Want to Do More Than Survive. She talks about abolitionist teaching. And when you just mention the need to do more than just reform, or the need to take these Band-Aid approaches, Bettina Love writes, and I want to get this right. And I'm looking at her book, and she says, abolitionists want to eliminate what's oppressive, basically. Abolitionists want not reform, not to reimagine the current system, but remove oppression from its roots. Abolitionists want to understand the conditions that normalize oppression and to uproot those conditions. And it's about, how do we build the conditions that create institutions that are just, loving, equitable, and that center Black lives? And when we think about imagining or dreaming of public education differently, I think you're right. It's not about reforming. I think Bettina Love is right. It's not about reforming. It really is about the work of abolitionists. And how can we decenter whiteness, really? How can we decenter whiteness? And everything that we do, how can we listen to and honor and love Black folks and people of color who've always been doing this work and who have not necessarily been taken up in critical ways that now in this moment we're talking about? How could we, I just think those are the questions.
Yeah. And let me sit in a space of not knowing, the humility of not knowing.
Yes.
But I had a thought there, and it went out.
No, that's fine. I think we talked about a lot of things.
Yes. Just what was the very last thing you said? That'll get it back.
Needing to listen to and love and honor the experiences of Black folks, decentering whiteness.
That's why I take notes. Most white people live segregated lives. The vast majority of white people live segregated lives, and particularly segregated from Black people, with no sense of loss about that. That, to me, the deepest message of white supremacy is white comfort in a segregated life. Most white people will go cradle to grave in racial segregation with no sense of loss. In fact, the whiter the life, the higher the status it will have. It's deep. I'm so sorry. And to that end, I mean, if the trajectory of my life would have me not know you, not love you, not be in relationship with you, right? I wasn't meant to know you, love you, or be in relationship with you, right? And I want to be really clear that proximity and acquaintanceness is different than living in a relationship, in authentic, sustained relationships across race. But that would be a place to start. I do think we've made much faster progress around lesbian and gay and non-binary queer movement. This is not to say that transphobia, homophobia doesn't exist, but I think that progress has been faster because from the time that kind of became something to talk about to where we are now, because most people know and love someone who is gay or trans, or no, maybe not trans, but gay, and so there's the human face, there's the humanity, there's our brother or our sister or our family member. And so we have to see Black people as family. And that takes not just knowing them, but knowing ourselves. It takes a lot of deep personal work into what I've internalized. It's a kind of a simultaneous process. And people might think, oh, this is all about interpersonal, or it's just, but we're not institutions, but we make up institutions. If you can't see it, you can't address it, right? And so that's where I would start. In a practical suggestion, there's a book written by Dr. Eddie Moore and others called The White Woman's Guide to Teaching Black Children. To teaching Black boys.
Yes.
And there's another one coming out to teaching Black girls. So there are tools out there until the revolution comes. and I would say that until the revolution comes, we do have a vastly majority white teaching force.
Yes.
And you can be a powerful intervention in this construct as a white person, but it doesn't come naturally. It doesn't come because you're nice. It comes because you are engaged in deep personal and institutional work. So we need to get engaged and stay engaged. And when people say, well, I've read this book or that book as a form of credentialing, my answer is, okay, great. And how will Valerie know you read that book? How will people of color know you read that book? What will actually be different? Because awareness without action is meaningless.
That's right. Awareness without action. I want to make sure folks hear that. Awareness without action is meaningless. So I can't believe we have 5 minutes left, and I'm not going to by far try to take the 5 minutes from you, but I do want to just share with you some of the things that I've heard.
Okay.
And, one of the things that you've talked about and you write about very well in your book, and it's in the conclusion, you write, the default of the current system is the reproduction of racial inequality. Our institutions were designed to reproduce racial inequality, and they do so with efficiency. And then you talk about how niceness is not courageousness. You just mentioned that a few minutes ago. I also heard today talking about admitting to our racial constructs of this country and its founding, the ways that white folks protect these racist foundations because they benefit white folks. You talked about how systems are designed to produce the results that they're meant to produce, and those results are at the expense of people of color and in the benefit of white people. You talked about being a white person and having a racist worldview, being entitled, being invested in the status quo, the demand for comfort over everything else, not wanting to be uncomfortable, being an insider to whiteness, understanding the tools that we need to use to dismantle, but how white folks oftentimes, large scale, don't dismantle, because to dismantle is to actually share or give up. You talked about white space, about the certainty of whiteness. The certainty of whiteness and how that is so complicated, because on the one hand, white folks as oblivious, but on the other hand, white folks as knowing exactly what they're doing and how it benefits them. And then it goes back to, I love the fact that you just talked about when you talked about racial pain and how to lessen racial pain, how to acknowledge the trauma of racism and whiteness and white supremacy on Black and brown bodies. And there is no sense of loss that some white folks have, and that's a problem. And if there's no sense of loss, there is no proximity to loving Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and other peoples of color, then what are we really reproducing? And it's the racism that's embedded within these institutions and these systems and within people themselves. So I just want to thank you for joining me in this conversation. I want to offer you space to say any final words that you might have before we conclude. And I will say that as you do that, the questions that I didn't get to ask relate to how might whiteness really not be fragile? We talked a little bit about that because it's like white fragility. White people, are you all really fragile in comparison to the harm and dangers that have been enacted upon Black and Brown and other people of color? But I hope we can have a conversation at another time. But
so do I, because you are fun and stimulating and wonderful to talk to. Thank you for that summation.
Oh, thank you for spending this time with me. This has been great. So any final words you want to make sure the folks who are listening to us really take hold to?
Well, we mentioned niceness, and actually I'll just go ahead and do a plug. My next book is going to be called Niceness is Not Courageous: How White Progressives Uphold Racism. It's coming out next summer. So I'll just leave you with that. But I think just that this is the most liberating, transformative work I could ever imagine being engaged in as a white person. And yes, it's painful at times, but I just want to say that once you start from the premise that you inevitably were socialized into this, you can stop defending, deflecting, denying, hoping they won't notice, and then just get to work actually aligning what you profess you value with how you actually live your life. It's so transformative, but we can't get there from the current paradigm. And so I would close with every moment that you want to exempt yourself or distance yourself or come up with your exception, ask yourself, and how has being white shaped how I experience whatever it is that I think is my exception? And again, that is a deeply rewarding process. So thank you.
Robin DiAngelo, author of White Fragility: Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. I will look forward to reading your new book next summer.
Thank you, Valerie.
Thank you so much, Robin.